Okay, so welcome to this podcast entitled Community Title. The podcast will go for about 15 minutes. It's meant to support your readings of the chapter in the textbook. A huge part of this course, but it is important for you to understand how community title can be created, the fundamental elements of a community title scheme, and some of the problems and issues that can arise with living in a community title arrangement. So let's get started. Well, what is community title? Well, it's a funny word, but in New South Wales they call it strata title. In other states they also call it strata title. Strata meaning levels, right? But here we call it community title. So here, in Queensland, we call it community title. So essentially, it's communal living, but it's not co-ownership as such in that more narrow sense that we were talking about in the previous week. Whereas, for example, a co-ownership arrangement was by joint tenants or tenants in common with the individual lot. So we're talking about the same lot as being co-owned. In a community title arrangement, we're talking about individual lots being separately owned, but within what is recognised through legislation as the one community title. So I'll give you an example. So if you look at that picture on the right-hand side, you can see multiple unit complexes, multiple units within a single complex. So referring back to our previous podcast, I was talking to you about the subdivision process. That subdivision process, if it was for residential living, could end up in a situation where you had community title. And in such a case, you've got an apartment complex with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, say 6 apartments there. They could be individually owned, but because they're part of the same building / complex, they're likely to be subject to this community title arrangement. So this is incredibly common throughout cities in Queensland. So we see an apartment building complex, and the reason for it is that so that the members of the community title, which are essentially the individual lot holders, have a say in how the entire complex is managed and how it is improved and maintained going forward. So this apartment down here could be owned by this guy. This apartment here could be owned by her. This apartment here could be owned by this guy, and so on and so forth. In our co-ownership arrangement, we were talking about 2 people or more, say these 3 people, owning one lot. Does that make sense to people? Obviously, you can't give me a response now because this is a one-way podcast. So I'm just assuming you get that distinction. We will, however, be talking about this concept of common property, which exists in a community title arrangement. And in such a case, we actually do have more of that co-ownership of an individual part of or an identified parcel of land within a community title scheme. So here's here is the process of subdivision, which I was talking about in the previous podcast. You had an original lot, and that original lot was subdivided or carved out multiple lots from that lot. So there might be townhouses, right, with a driveway here, driveway here, driveway here, and a bit of back garden and the townhouse on the lot. Alternatively, they could be in the airspace, in which case we have a apartment complex type situation, and that can also be a community title arrangement. So the process of subdivision can end in the creation of a community title arrangement. It need not, though, however, and I suppose that's the important point or an important point to take away, that if this was the original lot, freehold, right, they could create 3 separate freehold lots. These could have 3 separate houses on them and not be part of a community title scheme. On the other hand, they could be townhouses which are part of the scheme, if that makes sense to people. So it's an option for basically communal living. The main act you need to be aware of is this Body Corporate Community Management Act 1997. That does a couple of things: establishes the scheme itself and the process and the operation of it, creates a role, and this creates a role, and also sets up for the ongoing, I guess, management of the community title is done by this body called a body corporate, or this entity called a body corporate. And those of you who live in apartment complexes have probably come across them in one form or another. And their main role is to enforce the bylaws and to look after the maintenance of the property, and also to deal with any disputes that might arise within the property. The Act also creates a system of ownership and rights of common property, so there might be things outside of the individual ownership of those units or townhouses. For example, the driveway that comes into the community title scheme, or elevator complex, or elevator complex, an elevator within the complex, or a bit of parkland, or green space, a swimming pool. These types of things can be common property and owned jointly or co-owned by all the lot holders within the community title scheme. And the Act also sets up the administration and creation of bylaws. So we talk about bylaws towards the end of the podcast, essentially a set of rules which govern how lot owners and also the tenants, that is, if an individual lot holder decides to lease out their freehold to somebody, then that person is also subject to the bylaws because they're living within the community title scheme. There's also a couple of different regulation modules, which you don't need to know too much detail about. You just need to know that they exist. And there's a few sections within those modules. Basically, you know what regulations are. They set out a lot more detail than what the Acts provide. So if we're looking at a standard community title scheme, it would probably be relevant to look at the standard module, standard regulation module. That one is the one that's used in the textbook. There are some provisions there which I put on the left-hand side, which probably the extent to which you need to know that regulation. But of course, if you go into practice in this area, or if it's living in an apartment complex at the moment, you might need to know about these duties around common property and disposal of interests, and leasing, licensing common property, etc., etc. So all that extra detail is found within the regulation module. So a community title scheme is defined in section 10 of the BCCM Act as a single community management statement recorded in the registrar identifying the land, in the registry identifying the land. It includes the scheme land. It's got to have 2 or more lots, and it's also got to have some common property. So what we've been talking about is 2 or more lots. So you had an original lot, right? And we talked about the process of subdivision in the previous podcast. Let's just say you registered a volumetric format plan or a building format plan and created this community title scheme. You would need to have what is known as a community management statement for the original creation of the scheme. So it's essentially a document is what we're talking about. And to that will be attached the registered plan. So I'll show you one in a second. Once you've got that, for each community title scheme, there must be at least 2 lots. Well, in this case, let's just assume this entire building is residential. We've got one, say this is the foyer, this is the gym, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got 5 apartments in this complex. There's some common property. So there might be common property, it could be this swimming pool area, it might be the elevator going through the building, might be beneath the ground, might be the car park, driveways, things like that. It needs to have a single body corporate. We'll talk about the body corporate a bit later on. And it needs to have a community management statement, basically a statement as to how we're going to manage the whole scheme, and that it will include the bylaws. So here's an example of the community management statement. Well, not an example, I'll get to the example in the next slide. The CMS is essentially a document which identifies the scheme land, includes the name of the body corporate, any lot entitlements of each lot holder, and the bylaws for the complex. If they don't have bylaws, then there are going to be bylaws included for them in Schedule 4 of the Act. So you can see these bylaws here. which set out what you can do with vehicles, noise, blah blah blah. So they're essentially conditions of use of becoming part of that scheme. If you're the owner of the lot, or if you're a tenant. So, for example, those of you who are in apartment complexes under some sort of rental arrangement, you're also subject to those bylaws of the scheme. So you can see here the definition occupier is used, which is, I'd imagine, broad enough to cover both the landholder, sorry, the unit, the lot holder, as well as anybody who's a tenant. So here is the document I wanted to show you before. This is the community management statement. I'll put one up on the QT reading so you can look through it. Essentially what it is, this document here, if you're familiar with this type of format, is when you want to do something with the Queensland Land Registry in relation to a parcel of land. So in this case, we've got the subdivision of a parcel of land in Indooroopilly, or over near St Lucia actually, on the south side of Brisbane, where the fee simple is being subdivided to create multiple lots. In other words, 42 different lots. So they have to register not only this schedule of lot entitlements, in this case everybody's equal. In some cases there could be, if someone has a penthouse or something like that, they might, the contribution of their interest in the common property might be more. So, for example, that could be 5 if lot 1 was extremely large and had a bigger share of the common property, or a bigger share of the interest in the scheme, as well as contribution. And we'll talk about contributions shortly when we're talking about the common property. Yeah, this is just a document that looks like a community management statement. I put one up on Blackboard so you can have a quick look through that. At the end of this statement, there will be the registered plan for the scheme, which is the diagram or the map, which essentially shows how all those individual lots are divided up. And also included will be the bylaws. So this will be registered and will be available to be searched by anyone who wants to, for example, purchase a property within that scheme, so that they can then find out what the bylaws are. So here's another representation of what I was talking about in the previous slide, is to say we've got 42 lots. They might look something like this. So originally it was one lot on freehold land, and remember this can only happen on freehold land. That was made out quite clearly in your text, and not leasehold land. So we've got a fee simple lot being divided into 42 separate lots. The plan might also show common property for the area. This could be parkland or driveway or a road or something like that. And these individual lots or units, depending on whether they're in if they're it's a unit complex, then they can be owned individually by people. So I might purchase, for example, lot 10 in this community title scheme, and then I can sell it if I want the next day or in 10 months' time or whatever, or I could lease it out. So I am still the owner of the title, even though I'm within the scheme. It's just that I am being burdened by, you can think of it as a contract type arrangement, although it's more a statutory than a contract. But it's just that I'm being limited as to what I can do with my Unit 10 because of the fact that I'm part of the same scheme as all these other lot holders. So when we're talking about limits, one of the more important ones is this bylaws. So in that community management statement, which I'll put on the QT readings to look through, here's an example of some bylaws that come up. So you can see that the bylaws for each scheme, duty is on the body corporate to effectively enforce these bylaws. It talks about, well, where can you leave your rubbish on common property? What does the appearance of the lot need to look like? Storage of flammable materials, garbage disposal, all these types of day-to-day activities. So everybody who lives in that apartment complex or the townhouse complex needs to abide by these bylaws. So it's kind of like a miniature regulation system happening within their own complex. So you can see here the appearance of a lot. The owner or occupier of a lot, so owner, and that is me in the case of lot 10 in that previous slide, or occupier, if I lease out my unit to somebody, they become the occupier. They must not, without the body corporate's written approval, make a change to the external appearance of the lot. So that means that I cannot essentially create a, go out and put an air conditioning unit, for example, here. I need to get the approval of the body corporate. I have to pay a fee for them to look at it, $100 or something like that, for them to actually say, yes, you can put an air conditioning unit on the outside, or they might say no. So it depends on who's on the body corporate and what the appearance of the lot they want to maintain is. The owner or occupier of a lot must not, without hand washing bit, must not, well, the clothes are visible. So you can't even hang clothing out there. Display a sign, advertisement. So what you see here is that they're controlling the way in which you use the lot within the general communal ownership of the communal ownership's the wrong word. Community living of that scheme. And I suppose that makes sense. They're essentially a small society within that society, so that they want to maintain the integrity of the building and of the scheme land, and they've got to have rules around that. That's what the bylaws are doing. So the bylaws might also talk about driveways, visitors' rights, things like that. Common property is another important part of community title living. So here is a diagram which we're becoming more and more familiar with. The original freehold lot might have been subdivided, and what we've created is a series of multiple other lots. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's just say that's the gym level, and that's the entry level, and there's the underground car park. So those lot holders own their title. They own their title as freehold, right? As the fee simple, but they're subject to the bylaws. But the other thing that happens in a community title scheme is that you have common property. So this swimming pool might not be owned by this person. It is likely to be common property for all of the lot holders to use. So you can see section 35 of the BCCM Act says that common property for a community title scheme is owned by the owners of the tenants in shares proportionate to the interest schedule lot entitlements. So remember that wording we were looking at before in the community management statement, saying that each unit holder had a particular, each lot holder had a particular unit entitlement and contribution. Well, for example, they own it in proportion to their share in that in the scheme. So if they all own 1 out of 42, which they did in our example, then they would have an equal share. They'll essentially be tenants in common in equal shares. However, and that's if there was a person who had owned the penthouse, and they might actually this might be part of their lot, right, defined by the boundaries, or alternatively, it could well be that they have a greater interest in that common property. Contribution-wise, you might have heard of things like sinking funds and administrative funds. Well, those are things whereby the body corporate needs to maintain the property and needs to call on money from the lot owners, right? So your strata fees or your community title fees, and they ask you for them so that they can maintain, the common property around the area. Pay someone to clean the pool, pay someone to mow the lawns, to fix up cracking paint, all these types of things. So if you're purchasing a unit in a community title scheme, for example, you'd want to find out if there was any fund arrangements that were about to happen in the future. Okay, so let's talk very quickly about the body corporate. Essentially, the body corporate is an incorporated body that's created when the community title scheme is established. You can see here section 30 of the BCCM Act. That body corporate, the members of the body corporate are the lot holders in the scheme, that is the individual lot holders, or those people who own apartments, for example, in an apartment complex. They become the members, but the actual people who are on the body corporate can be owners themselves, or they might be a professional, they might outsource it to a professional organisation, body corporate manager, for example. That body corporate then has responsibility for looking after the common property. They deal with the lot owners over any disputes, generally they look after the financial issues, insurance, and things like that for the scheme. So here in section 152 of the BCCM Act, it's the responsibility of the body corporate to administer and control the common property of the scheme, and to ensure that the lot owners basically comply with bylaws as well. Although that's not included in 152, that's their other main task. There are these things called body corporate assets, which are not common property as such, but they might include things like, for example, these chairs here next to the swimming pool, the towel that this guy is carrying, obviously not the person himself, the plants, possibly chairs, tables, that type of thing, swimming pools, lilos, whatever. Not swimming pools, the lilos can actually be owned by the body corporate as a kind of personal property, but if you think about it that way. But they're owned beneficially. In other words, they're held on trust by the body corporate for the lot holders in the scheme. That's section 45 of the BCCM Act. Right, so I think that's basically all you need to know about community title living. I mean, this podcast is really just to supplement your reading of that chapter. It gives you an overview of what a community title scheme is. You need to understand that it creates a system of community living following the process of subdivision through a registered plan, a volumetric plan, or a building plan and building format plan. And that community title scheme will then have a body corporate who's responsible for enforcing bylaws against people. Also, it's their responsibility for looking after the common property within the scheme.